daughter throws her own father onto the street. The sun had barely risen when Catherine Anderson parked her luxury car in front of the small wooden house. Her high heels clicked loudly on the ground as she walked to the door, clutching a leather briefcase. Without hesitation, she knocked 3 times. Harold Thompson, a 78-year-old man, slowly opened the door. His tired eyes widened at the sight of Catherine. "Mr. Thompson, your time is up," Catherine said coldly. "You are 3 weeks late on the rent. I have eviction orders." Harold swallowed hard, his body trembling slightly. "Please, Ms. Anderson, I just need 1 more week. My pension check." Catherine interrupted him, handing him the papers. "You have 1 hour to leave. If you don't, I'll call the police." As Catherine spoke, Harold had a sudden flashback. He saw himself younger, hiding behind a fence, watching a little brown-haired girl playing on a swing. The girl was laughing, her floral dress swaying in the air. It was Catherine, or Emily, as he called her in his thoughts. Harold blinked, returning to the present. His hand trembled as he held the eviction papers. "Ms. Anderson," he tried again, his voice choked, "please understand. This house, it's all I have." For a moment, Harold remembered that terrible day, so many years ago. The day when, heartbroken, he handed his newborn daughter to a wealthy couple. He had just lost his wife in childbirth and couldn't afford to raise a baby. It was the hardest decision of his life. Catherine glanced at her wristwatch, impatient. "Mr. Thompson, I don't have time for this. Rules are rules. You knew the conditions when you rented the property." Harold tried once more, "But it's almost winter. Where will I go?" "That's not my problem," Catherine replied, her voice as cold as ice. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before you delayed the rent." At that moment, Harold saw in Catherine's eyes the same determination he had seen in the eyes of the little girl he used to watch. But now, that determination was mixed with something else, coldness and indifference. "1 hour, Mr. Thompson," Catherine repeated, turning to leave. "Not a minute more." Harold stood at the door, holding the eviction papers. Silent tears streamed down his wrinkled face. Slowly, he turned and entered the house. With trembling hands, Harold began to gather his few belongings. Old clothes, some photos, an antique watch. Each object brought a memory, a piece of his lonely life. While packing a small suitcase, his fingers touched something cold and metallic at the bottom of the drawer. It was the ring. The ring he had made so many years ago, with his daughter's name engraved on it. Emily. He slipped it on his finger, feeling its familiar weight. Outside, Catherine waited impatiently in her car. She glanced at the house from time to time, checking the time repeatedly. Exactly 1 hour later, Harold walked out the front door. He carried a worn suitcase and a plastic bag with some belongings. His shoulders were slumped, defeated. Catherine got out of her car. "The keys, please," she demanded, extending her hand. Harold looked at the house one last time. So many memories, so many years. With a deep sigh, he handed the keys to Catherine. "Thank you for your time here, Mr. Thompson," said Catherine, her voice emotionless. "Good luck." And with that, she got into her car and drove away, leaving Harold alone on the sidewalk. The elderly man stood there for a long time, holding his suitcase and bag, the ring heavy on his finger. He didn't know where to go or what to do. All he knew was that, once again in his life, he had lost everything. Harold walked aimlessly through the streets of Millbrook, his suitcase and bag growing heavier with each step. The sun began to set, painting the sky orange and pink, but Harold barely noticed. His thoughts were elsewhere, in another time. He remembered the day he landed the job as a gardener at the mansion next to the Andersons. It had been a stroke of luck, or perhaps fate. Harold had been passing by the imposing house, desperate for work, when he saw the owner struggling with a broken lawnmower. "Can I help, sir?" Harold asked timidly. The man, Mr. Jenkins, looked at him skeptically but nodded. Harold, who always had a knack for machinery, fixed the mower in minutes. "Are you looking for a job?" Mr. Jenkins asked, impressed. And so, Harold became the gardener of the Jenkins mansion, right next to where his daughter, Emily, now named Catherine, was growing up. As he walked through the darkening streets, Harold found himself back on that first day of work. He trimmed the grass, pruned the bushes, and planted colorful flowers. And then he saw her. Catherine, just 5 years old, playing in the yard next door. His heart nearly stopped. Harold shook his head, returning to the present. He needed to find a place to sleep. A park bench caught his eye, and he sat down, exhausted. Another flashback took him back to a sunny day in September. Catherine, now 6, was dressed in a new school uniform, a pink backpack on her back. Harold pretended to prune the bushes near the fence as he watched the scene. "Have a great first day of school, dear," Mrs. Anderson said, adjusting the bow in Catherine's hair. Catherine smiled, showing a missing front tooth. "Bye, Mommy." Harold's heart clenched. He should have been the one to take her to her first day of school. But he knew he had made the right choice. Catherine had a good life, much better than he could have offered. The chill of the night brought Harold back to reality. He huddled on the bench, pulling his thin coat tighter around him. The streets were nearly empty now, just a few cars passing by occasionally. Harold closed his eyes, but another flashback came. Catherine, at 12, winning a trophy in a math competition. He was there, trimming the grass on the school field, his chest swelling with pride as she walked onto the stage. A gust of wind made Harold shiver. He opened his eyes, looking around. The square was dark and quiet. For the first time, the weight of his situation fully hit him. He was homeless. With a heavy sigh, Harold opened his suitcase. He took out a thin blanket and wrapped it around himself. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. As he settled on the hard bench, another flashback enveloped him. Catherine, at 16, heading out on her first date. Harold was planting tulips when he saw the car approach. He watched, his heart tight, as his daughter, now a young woman, got into the car, laughing and waving to her adoptive parents. Harold opened his eyes, silent tears rolling down his wrinkled cheeks. He looked up at the starry sky, wondering how he had come to this point. The following days were a blur of hunger, cold, and loneliness. Harold wandered the streets during the day, looking for work, food, anything. At night, he returned to his bench in the square. One morning, Harold woke to the sound of children's laughter. He opened his eyes to see a group of students passing by, on their way to school. For a moment, he saw Catherine among them, her backpack swaying, her hair shining in the sun. But then he blinked, and the vision vanished. It was just another memory. Harold slowly got up, his bones aching from the cold. He folded his blanket and stored it in his suitcase. It was time to face another day. As he walked, Harold passed a store with TVs in the window. On one of them, he saw a familiar face. It was Catherine, older now, speaking on a local news broadcast about a new real estate venture. Harold stopped, watching his daughter on the screen. She looked confident, successful. So different from him now. With a sigh, Harold continued his journey. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to keep fighting. For Catherine, for the memory of the life he had watched from the shadows for so many years. And so, Harold Thompson, once a loving father and gardener, now a homeless man, continued his journey through the streets of Millbrook, carrying not just his suitcase and bag, but also the weight of a lifetime of memories and regrets. Catherine Anderson was driving her luxurious car through the streets of Millbrook, her phone wedged between her shoulder and ear as she shouted at someone on the other line. "I don't care how, just make it happen. That land needs to be ours by the end of the week." She angrily ended the call, tossing her phone onto the passenger seat. The traffic was heavy, and she tapped her fingers impatiently on the steering wheel. Her eyes wandered to the sidewalk, watching the people passing by. That's when she saw him. An elderly man, with unkempt gray hair and worn clothes, sitting on the sidewalk with a small sign asking for help. For a moment, their eyes met, and Catherine felt a strange pang in her chest. She shook her head, dismissing the feeling. "Focus, Catherine," she murmured to herself. The light turned green, and she sped off, leaving the old man behind. But something bothered her. The image of the elderly man lingered in her mind. His eyes, why did they look so familiar? Without fully understanding why, Catherine made a U-turn at the next corner. She drove back slowly, looking for the man. There he was, still sitting in the same place. Catherine parked her car and got out, hesitant. She approached the old man, who looked up at her with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Hello," said Catherine, her voice softer than usual. I don't know why I came back, but..." That's when she noticed it. On the trembling man's finger was a ring. A ring that she knew all too well. Identical to the one she wore, a gift from her adoptive parents, supposedly left by her biological ones. Shock hit her like a lightning bolt. Catherine staggered back, her eyes wide and fixed on the ring. "That ring," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Where did you get it?" The old man looked at the ring, then back at Catherine. His face turned pale. "Please," Catherine said, kneeling beside him. "I need to know. Does that ring have a name engraved on it?" The man hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. "It has the name Emily engraved on it." Catherine felt her heart race. Her hands trembled as she gently held Harold's arm. Her eyes, filled with a mix of fear and hope, fixed on his. "Please," she pleaded, her voice almost a whisper. "This ring, it's identical to mine. Every detail, every scratch. And the name Emily." She paused, swallowing hard. "My adoptive parents told me that was my birth name. A part of me I never knew." Catherine took a deep breath, gathering courage. "All my life, I felt something was missing. An emptiness I couldn't fill." Tears began to form in her eyes. "Looking at you now, seeing this ring, I feel like all the pieces are falling into place." She squeezed Harold's arm lightly, her voice choked with emotion. "Please, I need to know. Are you my father?" The man, Harold, felt his heart tighten. He looked into Catherine's eyes, the same eyes he had watched from afar for so many years. He wanted to tell her everything, embrace her, ask for forgiveness. But fear paralyzed him. "No," he said, his voice breaking. "It must be just a coincidence." Catherine stood up, frustration and confusion clear on her face. "I don't believe in coincidences," she said firmly. "There's something you're not telling me." Harold lowered his head, unable to meet his daughter's intense gaze. "Please, miss," he murmured. "I'm just an old, tired man. I have nothing to offer you." But Catherine wouldn't give up. She knelt down again, forcing Harold to look at her. "I know you," she said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. "I don't know how, but I know. Please, tell me the truth." Harold felt tears forming in his eyes. He longed so much to tell her everything, to embrace his daughter after all these years. But the fear of rejection, the shame of his current situation, kept him silent. "I'm sorry," he whispered, turning his face away. "You must be confusing me with someone else." Catherine stood up slowly, frustration and disappointment clear on her face. She looked at the ring on her own finger, then back at Harold. "I will find out the truth," she said firmly. "One way or another." With that, she turned and walked back to her car, leaving Harold alone on the sidewalk, his heart broken once again. Catherine couldn't sleep that night. The image of the old man with the ring identical to hers haunted her mind. The next morning, determined to uncover the truth, she returned to where she had met Harold. To her relief, he was still there, seated on the same sidewalk. Catherine parked her car and walked resolutely toward him. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but trembling. "I need to know the truth. All of it." Harold looked at her, his weary eyes filled with pain and resignation. He sighed deeply. "All right," he murmured softly. "You deserve to know." Catherine sat beside him on the sidewalk, ignoring the curious glances of passers-by. Harold began to speak, his voice choked with emotion. 45 years ago, he began, I was a different man. Young, full of dreams. Your mother and I were so happy. Harold closed his eyes, lost in memory. But then, on the day you were born, everything changed. Your mother, she didn't survive the childbirth. Catherine felt her heart clench. She had never known the details of her adoption. Harold continued, his voice shaking. I was alone, jobless, penniless. How could I care for a baby? It was the hardest decision of my life, but I knew I couldn't give you the life you deserved. He described the day he gave Emily up for adoption. How he held her for the last time, kissing her forehead gently. How he placed the ring in a small envelope, a final keepsake for his daughter. I watched you grow up, you know? Harold said, a sad smile on his face. I got a job as a gardener at the house next door to the Andersons. Every day, I could see you play, laugh, grow. Catherine was in shock. Memories of her childhood flashed through her mind, the old gardener who was always around, smiling kindly at her. Why didn't you ever say anything? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Harold shook his head. You had a good life, loving parents. Who was I to interfere? Just an old gardener with nothing to offer. Catherine felt a wave of conflicting emotions. Anger at being abandoned, sadness for Harold's story, confusion about everything she believed about her life. You watched me all this time, she asked, her voice rising. Saw my first steps, my first day of school, my graduation, and you never said anything? Harold lowered his head, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks. I wanted to protect you, to give you a chance at a better life." Catherine stood up abruptly, her body shaking. "You had no right," she said, her voice cold. "You had no right to make that decision for me." She began to walk away, then stopped and turned around. "All these years, I could have known you, could have had a father." Harold reached out his trembling hand toward her. "Catherine, please." But she was already walking away, rushing to her car. Harold remained seated on the sidewalk, watching his daughter leave once again. Catherine drove aimlessly, tears blurring her vision. Her entire life, everything she believed about herself, had been turned upside down. She parked in an empty park and finally let the tears fall freely. Meanwhile, Harold stayed on the sidewalk, his heart broken again. He looked at the ring on his finger, the only tangible connection to the daughter he had just lost once more. Night fell over Millbrook, father and daughter separated by decades of secrets and regrets, both struggling to understand what the future might hold after these painful revelations. In the days following Harold's revelation, Catherine plunged into a frenzied investigation into the past of the man who claimed to be her biological father. She hired a private detective, scoured old records, and spoke with older residents of Millbrook. Each new discovery confirmed Harold's story. Catherine found her birth certificate, listing Harold Thompson as her father. She also uncovered the death certificate of her biological mother, who had passed away on the day she was born. But it was in talking with the Andersons' former neighbors that Catherine made the most astonishing discoveries. The seemingly insignificant old gardener had left a profound mark on the community. "Oh, Mr. Thompson," exclaimed Mrs. Martinez, an elderly lady who had lived on the street for decades. "He was an angel. Always helping everyone, fixing things, tending gardens for free for the neighborhood widows." Other residents shared similar stories. Harold had organized a community garden, taught gardening to needy children, and even saved a dog from drowning in the park's lake. Catherine felt her heart tighten. The man she had scorned and evicted was, in fact, beloved by the entire community. With a heavy heart, Catherine finally mustered the courage to confront her adoptive parents. She arrived at their home one Sunday afternoon, her hands trembling as she rang the doorbell. Catherine, dear, her adoptive mother, Ellen, greeted her with a warm hug. What a wonderful surprise! But upon seeing Catherine's serious face, Ellen's smile vanished. "What's wrong, dear?" Catherine took a deep breath. "Mom, Dad," she said, looking at Robert, her adoptive father, who had just entered the room. "I need you to tell me the truth about my adoption." The ensuing silence was deafening. Ellen and Robert exchanged worried glances. How did you find out?" Robert finally asked. Catherine recounted her encounter with Harold, showing the identical ring she had. Ellen began to cry silently. "Is it true, then?" Catherine asked, her voice trembling. "Is Harold Thompson my biological father?" Ellen nodded, wiping away her tears. "Yes, dear. We always wanted to tell you, but..." Catherine suddenly remembered a scene from her childhood. She was 8 and playing in the garden when she overheard her parents arguing on the porch. "She has the right to know, Ellen," Robert said, exasperated. "But what if she wants to meet him? What if she leaves us?" Ellen replied, crying. Little Catherine didn't understand at the time, but now it all made sense. Back in the present, Catherine looked at her adoptive parents, people she had always loved unconditionally. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Robert sighed deeply. At first, you were too young. Then, well, it became increasingly difficult to find the right moment. Ellen took Catherine's hand. We love you so much, dear. We were afraid of losing you. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face. I love you too, she said softly. Nothing will change that. But as she hugged her adoptive parents, Catherine felt her entire world transforming. Her entire life, her choices, her values, everything seemed to be under a new light. She thought of Harold, the father who sacrificed everything to give her a better life. She thought of the community he had quietly helped for years. And then she thought of herself, the cold and materialistic woman she had become. Who am I really? Catherine wondered, feeling the weight of years of lies and secrets. That night, alone in her luxurious apartment, Catherine looked at her life with new eyes. The professional achievements, the money, the status, all seemed empty now. She picked up an old photo of her as a child with the Andersons. In the background, almost imperceptible, was Harold, smiling gently while pruning a shrub. How could I have been so blind? Catherine murmured to herself, touching Harold's image with her fingertips. At that moment, Catherine knew her life would never be the same again. It was time to reevaluate everything, to discover who she really was and who she wanted to be. With a heavy but determined heart, Catherine began to plan her next step. She knew she had much to learn, much to mend. And above all, she knew she needed to find Harold again. Determined to correct her mistakes, Catherine spent days searching for Harold on the streets of Millbrook. Finally, on a chilly morning, she found him sleeping on a park bench. Harold, she called softly, touching his shoulder. Please, wake up. Harold slowly opened his eyes, confusion and surprise in his gaze as he saw Catherine. He sat up quickly, shrinking as if he expected to be scolded. What do you want? He asked, his voice hoarse and defensive. Catherine's heart tightened at the sight of Harold's deplorable condition. I want to help, she said. Please, let me help you. Harold looked at her warily. Help? Like you helped by kicking me out? Catherine felt the weight of guilt in his words. I know I've made terrible mistakes, she admitted. But now I know the truth. I want to make things right. She extended her hand, offering a bag with food and clean clothes. Harold hesitated, his pride battling his need. I don't need charity, he muttered, but his eyes betrayed his hunger. Catherine gently insisted. It's not charity. It's the least I can do, Dad. The word Dad made Harold shiver. He looked at Catherine, seeing for the first time not the cold woman who had kicked him out, but the girl he had watched grow up from afar. Reluctantly, he accepted the bag. Thank you, he said softly. In the days that followed, Catherine visited Harold regularly, bringing food, clothes, and, most importantly, her company. Gradually, she began to know the man behind the silent gardener. Harold shared stories of his youth, how he met Catherine's mother, his dreams and hopes. Catherine listened intently, her heart filling with a mix of sadness and admiration. You gave up everything for me, she said one day, tears in her eyes. How could I have been so blind? Harold smiled sadly. I just wanted you to have a better life. And you did, didn't you? Catherine nodded, feeling the weight of Harold's sacrifice. She began to see her own life from a new perspective, questioning her choices and priorities. A week later, Catherine arrived at the square with a proposal. Harold, she began, nervously. I have an extra room in my apartment. Why don't you come live with me? Harold visibly tensed. Live with you? Yes, Catherine insisted. You can't keep staying on the streets. It's getting colder every day. But Harold backed away. I can't accept that, he said firmly. Why not? Catherine asked, frustration growing in her voice. I want to help. You don't understand, Harold replied, his voice trembling. I've spent decades watching you from afar, dreaming of the day we could be a family. But now it's too late. It's never too late, Catherine argued, tears in her eyes. Harold shook his head. I'm just a broken old man, Catherine. I can't come into your life now and pretend everything is all right. You have your own life, your career. I'd just be in the way. But I want you in my life. Catherine exclaimed, frustration and pain in her voice. Harold stood up, his posture revealing years of pain and resignation. I appreciate your kindness, Catherine. But I'd rather stay here. It's simpler this way. Catherine felt as if she'd been slapped. She had imagined that once she offered help, everything would resolve itself. But the reality was far more complicated. Please, Harold, she pleaded one last time. Let me take care of you. But Harold just smiled sadly. You are taking care of me, my daughter. More than you realize. With that, he turned and walked away slowly, leaving Catherine alone on the bench, fighting back tears of frustration and helplessness. As she watched Harold walk away, Catherine realized that the reconciliation she hoped for wouldn't be simple. Years of separation and pain couldn't be erased overnight. She would need to be patient, persistent, and, above all, learn to respect Harold's boundaries. With a heavy heart but determined not to give up, Catherine began to think of new ways to help her father, even from a distance. The journey would be long and difficult, but she was willing to travel it, one small step at a time. Frustrated yet determined to understand Harold's situation better, Catherine decided to volunteer at a local shelter for the homeless. On her first day, she arrived nervous, unsure of what to expect. Welcome to Hope Shelter, said Sarah, the coordinator. We're always in need of extra hands. You can start by helping serve breakfast. Catherine nodded, donning an apron. As she served, she observed the weary faces before her. Each had a story, she realized. Over the weeks, Catherine got to know the shelter's regulars. There was Tom, a veteran battling PTSD, Maria, a single mother who lost everything after a severe illness, and Jack, a young man who fled home due to abuse. You know, dear, said a lady named Rose, as Catherine assisted her with her medication, most people here never imagined ending up like this. Life can change in the blink of an eye. Those words resonated deeply with Catherine. She thought of Harold, how his life had drastically changed on the day she was born. One day, Catherine overheard Jack talking about his fear of accepting help from his aunt. What if she gets tired of me? What if I'm not good enough? He said, tears in his eyes. Catherine realized that these same fears probably haunted Harold. The fear of not being enough, of being a burden. Armed with this new understanding, Catherine decided to approach Harold again. She found him on his usual bench in the park. Hi, Harold, she said softly, sitting beside him. Harold looked at her warily. Hello, Catherine. Catherine took a deep breath. I want to apologize. Sincerely. Harold frowned, surprised. Apologies? Yes, continued Catherine, her voice choked. For the eviction. For being so cold and businesslike. I was so focused on business and profits that I forgot to be human. Tears began streaming down Catherine's face. I had no idea what you went through, the sacrifices you made for me. And yet, when you needed help, I turned my back on you. Harold was silent, absorbing her words. I understand now, she continued, that I can't just fix everything at once. That you have your fears and hesitations. And I respect that. Catherine gently took Harold's hand. But I want you to know that I'm here. Not because I feel obliged, but because I want to know my father. The man who gave up everything for me. Harold felt his own tears forming. Catherine, he said gently, you don't have to. I do, she interrupted gently. I need you to know that I'm sorry and that I'm trying to be a better person. For you, for me, for all the people I've ignored for so long. Harold looked into his daughter's eyes, seeing sincerity and genuine remorse. Slowly, he squeezed her hand back. Thank you, he said simply, his voice laden with emotion. Catherine smiled through the tears. Can we try again? No pressure, no expectations. Just getting to know each other? Harold hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. I think I'd like that. They sat in silence for a while, hands still joined, watching the park around them. It was a small step, but a significant one. In the days that followed, Catherine continued visiting Harold regularly. They'd share coffee and talk about simple things, the weather, the flowers in the park, memories of her childhood that Harold had secretly cherished. Harold still maintained a certain emotional distance. Years of loneliness and fear wouldn't disappear overnight. But Catherine noticed small changes, a more frequent smile, a more relaxed posture. One day, as they shared a sandwich, Harold hesitantly said, You know, I always wanted to tell you about the roses I planted when you were born. Catherine felt her heart race. It was the first time Harold had voluntarily shared a memory. I'd love to hear about it, she replied softly. As Harold told the story, Catherine realized that they were, slowly but surely, building a bridge over the chasm that had separated them for so many years. The road ahead would still be long, but now there was hope. Catherine sat in the doctor's office, her heart racing as she awaited the results. When the doctor entered with a smile, Catherine already knew. Congratulations, Catherine. You are pregnant. The news hit her like a wave. Joy, fear, insecurity all mixed together. As she left the office, she found herself automatically heading towards the park where Harold usually lingered. She found him feeding the birds. Harold, she called softly. He turned, immediately noticing Catherine's distressed expression. What's wrong? Catherine took a deep breath. I'm pregnant. Harold was silent for a moment, then a gentle smile spread across his face. That's wonderful, Catherine. She sat down beside him, tears in her eyes. I'm scared. What if I'm not a good mother? What if I make the same mistakes? Harold placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. You'll be a great mother, Catherine. You have a good heart. How can you be so sure? She asked. How did you cope when I was born? Harold closed his eyes, lost in memories. It was the happiest and saddest day of my life, he began. He recounted the day Catherine was born. How he held his wife Sarah's hand as she gave birth. The joy of hearing the baby's first cry. Then, the horror as the doctors announced that Sarah didn't survive. I was devastated, Harold said, his voice choked. I held you in my arms, so small and perfect, as I wept for the woman I loved. Catherine listened, silent tears streaming down her face. But then, Harold continued, you opened your little eyes and looked at me. And in that moment, I knew I'd do anything for you. Catherine held Harold's hand. Is that why you gave me up for adoption? Out of love? Harold nodded. I wanted you to have everything I couldn't provide. It was the hardest decision of my life. For the first time, Catherine truly understood Harold's sacrifice. The unconditional love that led him to give up his own happiness for her sake. Tell me about my mother, Catherine asked softly. Harold smiled, his eyes lighting up with memories. Sarah was incredible. She had a smile that could light up a room. And she was so kind, always helping others. He shared stories about Sarah, how they met, their first disastrous date, their wedding day. Catherine listened intently, absorbing every detail about the mother she never knew. You have her smile, Harold said softly. And your eyes, they're just like hers. Catherine felt a deep connection forming not just with Harold, but with the mother she had never known. When you were born, Harold continued, Sarah had chosen your name. Emily Catherine. Emily was her grandmother's name. Catherine was surprised. She had never known the origin of her middle name. Catherine, Harold said, looking into her eyes, you asked if you'll be a good mother. Let me tell you something, being a parent is scary. You'll never have all the answers. But love guides you. He placed Catherine's hand over her still flat belly. This baby is already loved. By you, by me. That's what matters. Catherine felt a wave of emotion envelop her. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in this new chapter of her life. Thank you. Dad, she said softly. Harold smiled, tears in his eyes. It was the first time Catherine had called him Dad. They remained there, sitting in the park, sharing more stories and memories. Catherine asked about her childhood, eager to fill the gaps in her story. As the sun set, Catherine realized she had gained more than just advice on parenthood. She had gained a connection to her past, a deeper understanding of her roots. As they parted, Catherine hugged Harold another first. I'll come back tomorrow, she promised. Harold nodded, a gentle smile on his face. I'll be here. Catherine walked home, one hand on her belly, feeling stronger and more prepared for the future. She knew there was still much to resolve, much to heal. But now, she had hope. And, more importantly, she had her father by her side. Catherine was in her office, gazing out the window while caressing her visibly 5-month pregnant belly. Her phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Miss Anderson? Megacorp has increased their offer for your company. They need an answer by tomorrow, her assistant said. Catherine sighed. The offer was tempting millions of dollars, more than enough to ensure a comfortable life for her, her baby, and even for Harold. But it would mean giving up the empire she had built with so much effort. Her thoughts were interrupted by another call. It was from the shelter where Harold had been living for the past few weeks, after much persuasion from Catherine. Miss Anderson, your father has collapsed. We are taking him to the hospital now. Catherine's world seemed to stop. Without a second thought, she grabbed her purse and rushed to the hospital. On the way, her cell phone kept ringing. It was the executives from Megacorp, eager for a response. Catherine ignored the calls, her heart pounding with worry for Harold. At the hospital, she found Harold pale and weak, connected to various monitors. The doctor pulled her aside. "Your father had a mild heart attack. He needs surgery, but considering his age and condition, it's risky." Catherine felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Do whatever is necessary," she told the doctor. Sitting beside Harold's bed, holding his hand, Catherine faced the biggest dilemma of her life. Her phone vibrated again. It was the Megacorp deadline. Harold slowly opened his eyes. "Catherine," he murmured, "shouldn't you be at work?" Tears streamed down Catherine's face. Even now, Harold was thinking of her first. "There's nowhere I'd rather be than here, Dad." Harold smiled weakly. "You've built an incredible life, Catherine. Don't waste your time on a sick old man." At that moment, something broke inside Catherine. All her priorities, all her materialistic values seemed insignificant. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling, "you're more important than any business. I've been wrong for so long. Chasing money and status, when what really matters is right here." Harold gently squeezed her hand. "You don't have to give up everything for me, dear." Catherine shook her head, a new determination in her eyes. "It's not giving up, Dad. It's choosing what really matters." She picked up her phone and, with trembling hands, called her lawyer. "Cancel the deal with Megacorp. I'm not selling the company." Harold looked at her, confused. "Catherine, what are you doing?" She smiled through her tears. "I'm choosing my family. I'll restructure the company, work fewer hours. I want to spend time with you, with my baby. I want to build something that really matters." Harold felt tears in his own eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Catherine nodded, feeling a peace she had never experienced before. "Absolutely. Dad, you gave up everything for me when I was born. Now it's my turn to prioritize what really matters." At that moment, Harold's monitors began to beep frantically. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, pushing Catherine out. "We need to take him into surgery now," a doctor said. In a panic, Catherine held Harold's hand one last time. "I love you, Dad. Please, fight." As she watched Harold being rushed away, Catherine felt the baby kick in her belly. She placed her hand over it, feeling a deep connection between the three generations. During the agonizing hours that followed, Catherine reflected on her life, her choices. She realized she had spent years building a fortress of success and wealth, but it was an empty fortress. When the doctor finally came out of the surgery room, Catherine held her breath. "Your father is a fighter," the doctor said with a smile. The surgery was successful. Catherine let out a sob of relief. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, caring for Harold, preparing for the baby, restructuring her company. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly on the right path. Entering the recovery room, Catherine took Harold's hand. "I'm here, Dad. And I'm not going anywhere." Harold slowly opened his eyes, a weak smile on his lips. "My Catherine," he murmured. At that moment, Catherine knew she had made the right choice. Money could buy comfort, but it couldn't buy the unconditional love she now felt for her father, for her unborn baby, and for the person she was finally becoming. 3 months had passed since Harold's surgery. Catherine, now 8 months pregnant, sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand. She had kept her promise, restructuring her company to spend more time with Harold and prepare for the baby's arrival. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" Catherine asked, smiling warmly. Harold, with color returning to his face, smiled back. "Better every day, thanks to you, dear." At that moment, Catherine felt a strong contraction. Her eyes widened. "Dad, I think it's time." The following hours were a whirlwind of emotion. Harold, still recovering, couldn't be in the delivery room, but he waited anxiously for news. Finally, Catherine entered his room, carrying a small bundle. Tears of joy streamed down her face. "Dad," she said softly, "I want you to meet your granddaughter, Sarah Emily Anderson." Harold felt his heart swell with love as he saw the baby's face. Catherine gently placed Sarah in Harold's arms. "Hello, little Sarah," Harold whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Welcome to the world." Catherine watched the scene, feeling a deep connection between the three generations. "Dad," she said, "I want you to be a part of her life. Of our lives." Harold looked at Catherine, his eyes shining. "Nothing would make me happier, my dear." In the months that followed, Catherine and Harold worked together to create a support program for the homeless. Using her company's resources and Harold's experience, they established the New Beginnings Project, offering shelter, job training, and psychological support. A year later, Catherine was in her new office, much smaller than the previous one, but with a photo of Sarah and Harold prominently displayed on the desk. She smiled as she heard laughter coming from the next room, where Harold was playing with Sarah. The phone rang. It was from the shelter they had recently opened. "Miss Anderson, we have 3 more families in need of help." "We're on our way," Catherine replied, grabbing her purse. She walked into the next room. "Dad, we have work to do. Want to come with us?" Harold, with Sarah in his arms, smiled. "Always." The scene shifts to a sunny park. Catherine, now with 2-year-old Sarah, and Harold are planting a small oak sapling. "Why are we planting this tree, Mommy?" Sarah asks curiously. Catherine smiles, exchanging a glance with Harold. "Because, sweetheart, this tree represents our new beginning. It will grow strong and beautiful, just like our family." Harold places the final shovel of dirt around the sapling. "And just as this tree needs care to grow, we also need to take care of each other and those around us." Catherine takes Sarah's hand and Harold's. "Exactly. And that's what our family does now. We help people have their own new beginnings." As they watch the small tree, Catherine reflects on the journey that brought them there: the eviction, the revelation, the forgiveness, and finally, the redemption. "You know, Sarah," Catherine says softly, "there was a time when Mommy was lost. But your grandpa taught me the true meaning of love and forgiveness." Harold smiles, tears in his eyes. "And you taught me that it's never too late to start over, to do the right thing." Sarah looks at the two of them, not fully understanding, but feeling the love that binds them together. Catherine kneels down, bringing herself to Sarah's eye level. "Always remember, my love, money and success are good, but what really matters is the love we give and receive." Harold places a hand on Catherine's shoulder. "And that forgiveness has the power to heal even the deepest wounds." As the sun sets, casting a golden glow over the park, the small family stands united around the newly planted tree. It is an image of hope, new beginnings, and the transformative power of unconditional love. Catherine looks up at the sky, thinking of her mother, Sarah, and smiles. She finally understands the true meaning of family and the legacy she wants to leave for her daughter. "Thank you, Dad," she whispers, squeezing Harold's hand. Harold smiles back, his heart full. "Thank you, my Catherine, for giving me a second chance." And so, under the starry sky, 3 generations, united by love and forgiveness, look to the future with hope and gratitude, ready to face any challenge, together. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our heartwarming stories. Share it with your friends so they can be moved too, and let us know what you think in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts and suggestions to keep bringing you content that touches